¿Qué tal? Bueno, voy a hacer como una pequeña introducción en español y ya me pongo al inglés. Creo que lleváis como una traducción simultánea que os han dado en la entrada, entonces, bueno, a ver qué tal se le da a los traductores traducir mi inglés de Huesca al español. Tengo curiosidad por saber, luego me contáis qué tal es. Y nada, primero estoy como muy ilusionado de estar aquí. Quiero dar las gracias a Capítulo 1, a las organizadoras del festival, a Matadero por acogernos en este lugar, y a vosotras y a vosotros por estar en este sitio con una autora tan importante y que, bueno, que con su libro El otro lado de la montaña, traducido aquí al español, pues ha servido, ¿no?, para impulsar muchos debates que estamos teniendo, ¿no?, a nivel global, pero también a nivel local. Así que, okay, that was my introduction. So let's just start with the conversation. I don't have the questions in a paper. I got them on the mobile phone because I'm young and modern. So that's the method that I'm going to use.
Well, I'm just going to go and do this on TikTok.
Okay,
instead.
yeah, later we can do that. Okay, so the first parts of my questions are from your book, and okay. ¿Que puedo leer? Okay.
Oh, I was...
So she has to read a small piece of her book because we have to do that in this festival. So we're going to just start with that, and then I can start with the questions.
I'm looking forward to it. Thank you, Moha. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me, Capítulo 1, and everybody who's come. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to read a section from my book. Sensuous Knowledge is called in English. It's El otro lado de la montaña in Spanish. And this is a chapter about womanhood, sobre la feminidad in the Spanish version. And I've just to give you some pretext, I've been writing about the journey of coming to womanhood, and I started my period, and how that for me was it was a negative experience in some sense, because it meant that I was on the threshold of becoming a woman, and I knew that was going to be somehow, or it felt to me like that was going to limit my freedom a little bit. Everywhere around the globe, women still accept and protect patriarchy in myriad ways. By executing traditions that harm women's bodies, or by carrying out unpaid labor within the domestic space, or by taking men's family names, or through worshipping male gods, or by supporting imperialism, or through heedlessly raising entitled boys who continue to oppress future generations of women. These are only some of the ways that women are patriarchal, and it is no accident that they are. Men know that the best way to dominate women is to manipulate them into oppressing themselves so that they don't have to. Male supremacists have always used culture, religion, tradition, politics, education, psychological tactics, and violence to force women to think patriarchally. Practices such as breast ironing, female genital mutilation, and widow punishment are often carried out by women themselves. Women are socialized to uphold denigrating views about women's roles in the family, in politics, in sexual life, and in society at large. Even those many women who hate patriarchy often have no choice but to succumb to its demands because of their social and financial positions. Detrimental as structural oppressions are, the ultimate weapon in turning women against women is the Euro-patriarchal nature of knowledge production itself. If our approach to knowledge production is patriarchal, then ultimately everything we know and everything we do as a result of what we know will be patriarchal too. If knowledge production is systemically anti-woman, then those values will shape everything from our intimate relationships to our social structures. It is in those deep recesses of ingrained psychological and social behavior that seeds for lasting change can also be planted. Moreover, because those interior places are indeed especially affected by poetry, creativity, and imagination, to rescue womanhood from the unpeople position it has held for too long, we deleteriously negate the imaginative, playing, exploring patterns, using mixed methodologies such as stories, sound, or embodied analysis and synthesis that has always constituted women's ways of knowing in favor of administrative and bureaucratic indices and statistics. Within this psychosocial context, I contend that women are patriarchal because adulthood is by default constructed as manhood. And so becoming an adult when you are female means appropriating manhood. By adulthood, I don't in this instance mean attaining a legal age, buying a house, having a pension fund, or other signifiers of the responsibilities that come with being a grown-up. Instead, I am reflecting on adulthood as it relates to the more complex behavioral sense of personhood, which involves feelings of independence, self-worth, strength, fearlessness, clarity of thought, responsibility, and most of all, self-reliance. Likewise, by manhood, I mean not maleness per se, but rather the value system that is constructed around men and masculinity. Since the psychosocial conditioning of manhood contains an abundant element of sexism, that is, the reduction and resentment of that which represents the feminine, when a woman transitions toward adulthood and begins to appropriate conditioned male psychology, being that adulthood is equated with manhood, she simultaneously enters a landscape of self-loathing. This was why my becoming a woman terrified me. I was standing on the threshold of what I perceived to be a threat to my sense of self-worth. My fears were justified. If indeed adulthood is psychosocially defined by manhood, then womanhood, if it can be psychosocially defined by any one thing at all, it is defined by a lack of maleness. Whether this manifests as the lack of a boy child, a husband, or attributes that will gain the approval of men, such as a specific look and body type, a particular demeanor, and so forth, a woman is always chasing something that she perceives to be essential to her very womanhood, but that in reality is necessary to her proximity to manhood. This is why, if and when women attain the deep sense of independence and self-reliance that form personhood, which for many women is later in life, say after a divorce, when they find themselves asking for the first time what they really want out of life, their new attitude is invariably associated with manhood. They are told that they act or think like a man. A woman who acts like a woman implies a woman who upholds accepted, submissive, self-deprecating norms. We have to wonder why, when boys are being raised to attain personhood from childhood, we haven't insisted on the same for our daughters. Until little girls can proudly grow into women who act like women when they are being self-assured and autonomous, as much as when they are being compassionate or emotional, then feminist work is incomplete. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Minna, for this powerful reading. And I encourage you to read the whole book, not just this part. And, well, we have to just start with all these questions because I'm just looking at this timer and I feel like in the Skid Games, El Juego del Calamar, with the timer, and I'm just, okay, we have to start. Okay, the first question is around knowledge. So I think we are living in a moment where we are creating more and more feminist and anti-racist and Afrocentric knowledge around the world and from different perspectives and from different parts of the world. But also in your book, you express the fear that this knowledge continues to follow Euro-patriarchal patterns. So at this point, do you feel optimistic about all this knowledge production?
What a great question to start with. Yes. I see where you're going. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes, I do feel optimistic. And partly actually for the slightly odd reason that we have just come out of, or we're still in the process of coming out of the pandemic. So much has happened in such a short time, and I think that this, huge crisis kind of caused us to want to rethink everything. And so quite suddenly, the mainstream are having conversations that we have been having in Black liberation movements, in feminist movements, in all kinds of social progress movements, where we've been saying, particularly in the Black feminist movement, where we've been talking for decades about how different oppressive systems are connected. So how gender oppression, race oppression, and class oppression are connected, but also how a certain type of, emphasis on like a kind of robotization of knowledge production and of society is what informs these oppressions, and the simultaneous exploitation of the more than human world, the natural world, and women's bodies, right? So all of these topics that we have been discussing for so long, it's almost surreal to me some days, when I look at it and I think this is now being spoken about in the mainstream in a way that 5 years ago, 2 years ago, was not happening. And I think that is indeed infiltrating also our movements, because we realize that yes, we were onto something, and yes, we've been saying this for a while, but it's also making us rethink and re-emphasize, what lies, the seeds at the core of these various struggles. Part of why I think your question is so great, because it's kind of the very motivation that I had with writing the book, was having for so many years, like over a decade, I've been very lucky to do a lot of grassroots advocacy around the world at all kinds of platforms, cultural, universities, small feminist groups. And even though people are doing such amazing work, I realized that, it bothered me that why are we still not getting anywhere? I know that our lineages, our ancestors were already doing this work, and we're still fighting the same struggle. Why is that? And for me, it seems that it's because we're using the same kind of approach to knowledge. Even though we're saying that we want to free ourselves, the approach is still being informed by what I call Euro-patriarchal knowledge. And maybe to make that a bit more concrete is the word power, for example. For feminists, for Pan-Africanists, in all of these movements, power is obviously so central to the debate. And yet, I find that there is so little kind of reimagining of what power itself means. And so when we talk about changing power or reclaiming power, if we're still thinking about power in the way that Euro-patriarchal systems have defined it, as synonymous with authority or coercion or violence even, then when we talk about reclaiming power, something quite dangerous can be happening there. So in the chapter in my book about power, I try to reimagine the concept. So that's kind of.
And do you feel as a problem that some of this knowledge production come from a place of a disgrace, kind of the last years after the assassination of George Floyd in the US? There was like a huge interest on the anti-racist books, and that, do you think that can be a problem, that all this interest came from that place and not from a place of, as we were talking before, from a place of joy, from a place of optimism, from a place of hope. What do you think about that?
I'm happy that it happened. I'm not happy, of course, what happened to George Floyd. That's terrible. But I'm happy that the awareness has grown. It would have been ideal if it grew from something else and just from a recognition that we're all humans and deserve to be treated equally. But it's good that those conversations are taking place, of course. What concerns me about it, now that it has happened and that these shifts and conversations are going on, I guess, to directly respond to your question, is that it's still, from a lot of white people, it seems like the impetus, the drive to change things is because something horrible happened to black people. And that makes them feel guilty. And that, sure, that can be an interesting and important sentiment to have. But really and truly, I think until we have this feeling that we're all in the same boat, if you live in a society where the institution, the legal body that is supposed to protect you, which is the law enforcement system, if that legal body is so discriminating against one group in your society, then how can you feel safe yourself? Even if they don't hurt you, even if they don't hurt people that are like you, this is the people that you're supposed to trust your lives with, And I think if anti-racism came from that feeling, like we all want it to change because we're all being part of a corrupt system, then it would have a more long-lasting effect.
Okay. So the next question is about the chapter of liberation. In your book, you quote Lauryn Hill a lot of times, which is wonderful. And you also take a brief look at the music as a way to explaining the history of blackness around the world. So yesterday I was listening to Stromae, which is the Belgian musician, and who came back with a song about the essential workers. And my feeling is that artists like Lauryn Hill or Stromae or others have sometimes a hard time to reach the mainstream. So my question is, does music has a future as a force for liberation?
Absolutely, yeah. Also because I don't actually know the other artists that you meant, so that really is...
Okay, but I would say that he always uses social messages in his songs, like Lauryn Hill.
Okay, fantastic. And does he have a big following? Is he making an impact?
He now has a big following, but I think he's kind of an exception, especially thinking about other authors and other artists that don't reach the mainstream in the same level as maybe Lauryn Hill or Stromae. Yeah. So so my question is if music still has a future with all this capitalism around us and taking out all these social messages from the artists and the source. So does music still has room for being part of these liberation movements?
I really, really hope so. And I think in one sense, things are far worse. The hyper-capitalist machine has taken over a lot of the radical musicians. It promotes a really superficial, quite often dangerous message to young people in particular. But then on the other hand, for instance, when Lauryn Hill released the MTV Unplugged album, which so in my book, I use the album as a text because that's how I see it. It's a treatise. I don't think it's only music, even though there's nothing wrong with something being only music, but it's a philosophical text about resistance. And in 2000 or 2001, when it came out, I mean, she was so vilified to the point that she just, she kind of disappeared for years. She was called crazy. It was just terrible, and I remember finding it really sad at the time. I now imagine if that had happened today, and with all the social media, I wonder if that would have actually happened, because there's a way to bypass the gatekeepers today. And even if it would be a smaller group of people, I would certainly be on social media, going, what the F, like this
tweeting all her songs.
Yeah, so I have hope in that sense. But because I do think that for, maybe for Black people in particular, but for all marginalized groups and also the feminist movement, but for Black people especially, music, it's so ingrained into our cultural legacies that music is a form of education. And if you look back at African history, the griots, the musicians have always passed knowledge through this form, right? And so many of us, already as teenagers, the way that we come to learn that the educational system is not always working in our favor, to put it mildly, is through artists, through music. And I don't think that you can fully placate certain genres. The industry can try really hard with hip hop, with reggae, with Afrobeat, but you can't fully take away that radical spirit that those genres have, I think.
I'm happy that you mentioned the griots, because I grew up in my family with Ganda Fadiga, which is a griot from Mali, and my parents used to listen to him a lot, and I really kind of hate him, but now I see how he wasn't just doing music, he was telling the stories and making that we know the stories of the elder people and the stories of some communities. So now I feel the importance of his messages. But when I was 8 years old, I was
not again.
Put some Operación Triunfo or other thing. Okay, so that's question. I see maybe the questions are a little bit hard, but it's okay. I'm going with a quote from your book. This is a quote from Bell Hooks. She says a theory can be shared in everyday conversation. A theory that cannot be shared in everyday conversation can be used to educate the public opinion. So, do you think that we run the risk of turning these social justice movements into just an intellectual movement without much action, having just conversations where we talk and talk about the issues, but we don't get into the action?
I think that the risk is actually that we separate between intellectualism and action. Mm-hmm. And so the more we do that, the more we think that when we're being intellectual, we have to come up with really big words and we have to be very complex and, it has to be more difficult than it necessarily is. I think true intellectualism is actually, or put it this way, it's far more difficult to explain complicated things in a simple way than it is to complicate things that are simple, which is what happens a lot when we separate intellectualism from action. If we think of intellectualism as action, then the imperative is to make it clear, because the whole point is that this is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking through, I've done a lot of research, and I want people to act upon it, so it's in my interest to clarify. So I think I had something on my mind that I've just lost my train of thought.
Yeah, maybe about the action, if that can turn into action, or you were saying that we cannot separate that intellectual...
And your question, the direct question was?
Yeah, my question was if all this, if we have the risk that in our social justice movements, we just stay in this part of intellectual movement and just talking about the issues and not getting into action to tackle all the struggles that we face.
Right, so what I wanted to add to that in terms of like distinguishing between the two is that what is happening all the time there is that we have activists on one side, we have the writers and thinkers on the other, but not only that, these groups are also separated into like the young and the old, the women and the men, and we really, I think in synthesizing intellectualism with activism, we also then, what really emerges is that it's just conversation, I think what we need and what is actually activism is talking to each other, as we are doing right now, to really just talk. And if a big grand theory comes to mind, then I'm going to want to explain that, or vice versa, or somebody in the audience later. And furthermore, in that talking, we have to talk to the elders. We live in such a youth-obsessed culture, and it's very important that we hear what young people have to say, because you are going to be around for much longer than the rest of us. But I also feel like I want to hear from the grandmothers and the grandfathers, and I want to hear from the little children. I want to know what a 5-year-old thinks about, feminism or the future. So really just talking. I think if we thought about that, then we would automatically end this division between action and intellect somehow.
Okay. Cool. So next question. In the book, you also talking about identity. In the book, you talk about the idea of the fragility of identity. So how does this idea fit in a time where we are talking about the identity politics as something negative? So I want to know from your perspective how these two ideas have a conversation in the public debate.
I think so much of what is happening, and this relates to the previous point, so much of what is happening right now is that ideas and actions that people have spent very long amounts of time on developing, on researching, on really thinking through, they become disseminated into civic discourse without the contexts, without the layers and the deeper meanings of things. Identity politics is an incredibly powerful and actually, it's almost a poetic concept when you look back at where it came from originally, which was one of the first Black feminist organizations called the Combahee River Collective. In the 1970s, they wrote a manifesto in which they coined this phrase, identity politics. And what they did was that in a time when to be a Black woman was pretty much to be invisible in public discourse. There were very, very few Black women who were allowed. There were very few women and very few Black people, let alone Black women. And they said that to speak from our position as Black women is therefore a political act. It is an identity politics. Now today...
the meaning has changed a lot.
It has changed completely, and that's okay because concepts can change. But I think that for a lot of people who either use it as something positive or who are critical of it, if they looked into the trajectory of this phrase, it would just help to expand the conversation. And that's something that I feel we have to encourage more in the culture.
So do you think at this point we should continue to fight for the original meaning of the identity politics, or just change and look for another word or another concept that can be used and that doesn't have that negative impact in some part of the society?
I think that we should, probably, yes. I suggest in the book to think of identity as a compass. But I also think that those of us who do know about the history have to clarify that, especially to those, particularly on the right, who use it as if it's something that just popped up, 2 days ago, when it actually has this long journey as a phrase and as a politics. But I do think that, partly it's not as useful anymore because it isn't true now that black women don't have any space in the public domains. We still don't have as much space as we should. And this may seem, to some people, it's like we do see a lot of black women around, at least in the UK and the US, but quite often it is, doing the kind of work that I do. It's speaking about race, speaking about gender. We still don't see a lot of black women speaking about futurism or speaking about artificial intelligence, all these things that are really going to shape the future of all of humanity. So there is still some need for that, but at the same time, of course, we've infiltrated culture, politics, etc., to a far greater extent. And so I think there is a need to refresh that. And I think that is happening. We never stand still. Like, there's people reinventing and reconceptualizing identity. I think that identity it's almost, when I say identity as a compass, it's to be aware of race and gender and things like that and how they can negatively impact our experience as humans on this planet. But I also think identity is a doorway into inquiry, about the other. So I come with my identity. I know you have a different one, and I'm curious about you. I want to know, what is your identity? What is it like to be you in this planet, And without identity, we couldn't really do that. So identity is actually also this doorway to inquiry in a very exciting way somehow.
Yes. Okay. We still have time. Like the skip games, they don't stop. So, okay, in one part of the book about sorority, you talk about your conversation with a black woman in a Foyle's bookshop, where she says that she doesn't speak to white people. And that reminds me to the words of Esther Mayoko, who I think is here. She is a black LGBT feminist in Spain. And recently in an interview with Lucian Bomio, which is another black journalist, also based in Spain, she made this question to the white feminist, okay? Are you willing to talk face-to-face without imposing your agenda? So I know that the question is not for you to answer, but I want to know if you think that this dialogue with the white feminists is possible, and how.
I definitely think it's possible. I think that we have to be quite careful in, it's a little bit like with identity politics. The phrase. I'm very precious about language and words whenever I can, because no doubt I often use it recklessly, but I try to be mindful, and one of the areas, obviously, that I care deeply about is feminism. And I think that when we say things like, can we have a dialogue with white feminists, we're being reckless with the language a bit, because white feminists are not a monolith. there are radical white feminists, liberal, Marxists, right, conservative, all kinds of white. And I don't think we can approach the topic until we make those distinctions. There's at the moment, there's a lot of criticism against this monolith white feminism. And I actually think that somehow does a service to the thing that feminists of color are trying to critique. I think it's more useful to say that there are racist feminists. And I'm not interested in having a dialogue with racist feminists. Like, that's I don't have that kind of energy. Mm-hmm. But it's almost like we're afraid to just say that. There are feminists who are racist, and they are definitely not going to be part of helping women collectively. But there are white feminists who are absolutely willing, I think, to have radical conversations about race, about class. In the book, I make a distinction inspired by Audre Lorde. She has an essay where she talks about, I think it's titled, "Your Silence Will Not Protect You," which she addresses to white feminists. And so I extrapolate from that to say that there are feminists who are, I can't remember the exact phrase I used, but who are sort of maintaining silence, solidifying silence, and then there are feminists who are breaking silence. And I'm in the camp with the feminists who are breaking silence wherever they come from. If that's what you want to do as a feminist, then let's do it together. And the more of us doing that, the stronger we are,
Perfect. Okay, so in the chapter on femininity, you talk about the figure of Winnie Madikizela Mandela and how she was socially portrayed in a way that was far from the truth, only identified as Nelson Mandela's wife. And so this question is kind of more personal. So how do you feel you are being portrayed socially, like in the society, after the release of your book, with all the talks you give? So can you escape from those narratives?
I miss Winnie Mandela so much. She was an amazing figure. And I think, I say this very humbly, but I'll draw from her example to respond to how I feel I'm being perceived. I think she stood her ground. That's the lesson that she leaves, is that she really, she was her own woman, and she didn't put her energy into resisting her narrative. She just did what she had to do, And of course she was a very complex figure, and she did things that may be morally questionable. But that's what I'm inspired to do, and that's what I'm doing. That's what I've always done. I refuse to comply. I refuse to be put in a box. I have this one life. I've dedicated my life to Black feminism, and that's what I'm going to do. And of course, there are going to be people who say, "Oh, she does it the wrong way," or "She says this." I very often get asked, less and less, but I would very often get asked, "Oh, what is it like to write about fashion?" And there's nothing wrong with fashion, I love fashion, but it was usually men who asked me this question, "Oh, you write about fashion." And it's a way of trying to diminish you and say that, "Oh, you're not talking about critical ideas," and stuff like that. So, but yeah, instead of focusing my energy on writing a response to that, for example, I'd rather put it into just doing what I feel is important.
Nice. And the second question around this, in your book, when you talk about reconfiguring this femininity, so if you can explain how do you do that? How can we do that?
How we can configure...
reshape this femininity.
Yeah. there's so many things that need to happen. One that is really important is, of course, in how we raise our children, both girls and boys. I think when it comes to patriarchy, there are three things that a woman can do. She can accept it, she can agree with it, and she can oppose it. And what we should do is oppose it. What I certainly do is oppose it. And I think in that kind of opposition to patriarchy, an automatic reshaping happens. Because you start to, we think of feminism as something that is so much about doing, but in many ways it's a process of learning, it's a way of being in the world. And the more you start to inform and expand your awareness about what 21st century patriarchy looks like, by reading books, by listening to conversations with feminists, and so on and so forth, the more clarity you get. And the more clarity you get, the more you oppose patriarchy. And the more you do that, you just sort of automatically reshape your life a little bit. I've been thinking a lot about time, which I think a lot of people have over the pandemic and lockdown. And I'm quite interested in like feminist time, in how things. So with time, you have there's kind of three major tenses. So time is, we typically think of it as chronological. That's the conventional way. Time can also be anachronistic, so moving backwards. And then you have what is called isochronous time, which is when everything's happening at the same time. And I'm developing at the moment a thought which would be Chrono-Feminist Time. And what that is that even while, two women, two people are experiencing something that's identical in nature, because of a kind of feminist awareness, you experience time differently. So if you are a woman who feels disempowered in a space that's male-dominated, for instance, and you have to be in a meeting with a group of men for an hour, that hour is going to feel very long to you. Really. But if you are on chrono-feminist time, and you have expanded your awareness and you understand that, the reason I'm feeling uncomfortable is not necessarily because I lack confidence, it's because this space was designed to make me feel excluded, and the culture is designed that way. And you might not experience that hour that long. You have a different perception of actual time in the very same kind of space.
Okay. That is very interesting because I never heard about this chrono-feminist
Well, I
time.
Recently, I think I came up with it. Somebody else may have, but yeah.
So maybe you are...
Unless you can read into my brain.
Maybe you are writing about this idea.
It is part of something I'm thinking to develop.
El titular, lo tenemos ahí.
Yeah.
Okay, so outside of the book, a few weeks ago you posted on Instagram a post saying that protest about how the logic of the market has co-opted ideological movements are relevant but miss the real problem. And then you say that the war of the conscious mind and feeling hard is the one war the market hasn't won yet. So I need you to explain this idea because I'm reading this, I just was kind of understanding what you were saying, but probably I just needed a more explanation on that. So.
Well, thank you. Can you just remind me? So I said that the market has.
Okay.
The one thing that the market cannot.
The war of the conscious mind and feeling hard is the one war the market hasn't won yet.
Okay, yes.
Maybe I can go to your Instagram and you can just read the
I
post.
can't remember what inspired that post, because that might help me answer the question. I think it may have been, oh yes, so Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez.
After the Met Gala
Yes,
incident, yeah.
I think that might have been what inspired that one, I'm not sure. But yes, I felt it's complicated, and I mean, I think this US politician on the left, many people I'm sure know about her here, she wore a dress to the Met Gala. What did it say again? Eat the rich.
Tax the rich.
Tax the rich, okay.
Yeah.
And I think since then there have been already like some policy changes. So obviously it has an impact. But at the same time, I just thought, oh God, like yet another cause that is just going to be co-opted by the capitalist class and turned into a profit-making machine. And yeah, like so much has been lost to that. And yeah, so what I mean by that consciousness, the questions of the heart and the mind, is really ultimately about wanting to expand our minds, our lived experience, not just in terms of our knowledge, like information, but the way that knowledge can sieve into our bodies and souls. And I mean, to put it more practically, it is crazy when you think about how we conduct our most intimate personal relationships with each other on platforms that have a very clear capital interest. And we do that mindlessly. And so what I'm kind of saying in that post is, of course we're still going to use whatever we use, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. But if we just constantly also strive to not allow our hearts and minds to be bought by the capitalists, then I think it's a subtle change, but maybe it changes how we approach these questions. And I think, you know, Alexandria, all the love and respect to her, of course, but I feel like that was a moment where she lost that a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, another headline for the media. And last question, because before the questions from the audience. So if you have any question, think about it. A brief question, like we don't want like an essay in here, so just direct questions. So the last one. I think we would like to hear a couple of recommendations from you. So one, if you can tell us an initiative that you know or that you are part of that that you like and you want to recommend, and a book that we should read, like mandatory.
I absolutely know which book I'm going to recommend, but initiative. Anyway, I'll let that come to me.
Maybe you can just start by the book.
I'll start with the book. So I recently read this book by an author called Marie Ndiaye.
Marie Ndiaye.
Ndiaye. She lives in France. I'm not sure where she comes from. I know she's from an African country originally.
It seems like Senegal. Like think Ndiaye is a Senegal.
Right. Yes, but you know how these are all inventions at the end of the day. But yeah, it's called Self-Portrait in Green. And it blew my mind. It is amazing. She was asked to write a memoir, and she ends up writing this. It's a kind of a novella, but it's a memoir at the same time. And it's about this character who sees women in green all the time. Like either they're wearing green, or they are holding a green object, or there's something with green constantly going on. And it's very hard to describe this book, but basically the way I would put it is that it is written with a West African with the West African spirit, a kind of worldview. I grew up in Lagos in Nigeria, and there's a specific type of blurring the lines between fiction and non-fiction, between poetry and philosophy that we do, right? And she's managed to write this book in that way without it becoming confusing. It's almost like you read it with your unconscious, but it makes complete sense. You know, like a dream is in the unconscious, but it doesn't always make sense.
Yeah,
but this book, I could talk about it for so long. It's read it. It's so good. It's also actually a little bit scary. Like,
It has a lot of ingredients, this book.
Yeah, like it reminded me of hearing ghost stories as a child and being afraid. I almost was scared to turn the page. Like, what am I going to find? But it's really feminist. It's amazing. And an initiative. I'm just going to say, the feminist movement, the global feminist movement, it's bigger and bigger with every day, but it's still very small. I mean, the amount of women and men who actively call themselves feminists, who engage with the feminist movement, is tiny. We still don't see celebrities, sports icons, politicians who are engaging with it. And so, join the global feminist movement.
Thank you. So now is the time for the questions. So if you have any questions, there is a mic in here. So we have a little bit more than 5 minutes. Okay.
Thanks. So one question is about, you were talking before about how George Floyd became kind of like the opening shot of forcing the conversation about racism and law enforcement, particularly in terms of police brutality. And it seems that it's often the US that's kind of leading the way in forcing those conversations. And I'm curious whether you think there is something that in Europe is being forcing those conversations. Like, how is Europe leading the way, whether it's on racism or feminism, that you think that Europe is actually leading the way?
I found it really difficult to hear the question. Did you? Yeah. I think, would she be able to ask without the mask?
Más alto que se te oiga.
I'm sorry. I speak really fast.
Sorry.
So I was mentioning how, as we were starting the conversation, that the death of George Floyd really forced the debate on police brutality and racism. And even though it was in the United States, there was a global awareness. And I was wondering if there's something that you think Europe is leading the way in terms of racism or feminism, where it's Europe who's actually forcing that debate or forcing that conversation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks for repeating that. I don't really think in those terms, like Europe is too abstract. I think that there are Europeans who are doing amazing things, leading the way. I think that Europe is in a unique position vis-a-vis America, for example, in that it's all these different countries. And I think that there's a growing desire for Black communities across Europe, for example, to do events, to collaborate. That's something that's really exciting and could influence similar collaborations in South America, maybe even in Africa, where we're still so limited because of the legacies of colonialism from interacting. But I don't think Europe. If anything, sadly, I think Europe as an entity is leading the way in regression of racial questions, with putting up more borders and right-wing, supremacists, alt-rights movements, and populism is growing everywhere in Europe. So it's a really worrying time, actually, insofar as Europe is concerned as a continent.
Another question? Esther Mayoko.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Minna. Thank you very much. Hi, Moha. Thank you very much, too. My English is really bad, but I hope you can understand me. So I want to say a lot of things, but in the line, the last question, do you think there is a possibility for have a voice like Afro-Europeans and Afro-feminists in Europe who could drink from the knowledge of our mothers and ancestors and so on, but at the same time a different voice, because we are here. We born or grow up here, and this is very different from the continent, you know. So maybe we could improve something else for these specific Spanish or Afro-Spanish or Afro-European feminist movement in this way of killjoy, you know, like Hama Taido said. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very
And
much.
of course, different too from US black feminism, because this is a strong and long history, and it's not the same way here, you know. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. What a great question. It's so hard because we lack support. We lack support structures, and we've been doing these things by ourselves for so long, and it can be really tiring. I think there's sometimes like a collective fatigue because, African descendant feminists, there's so much to do for you here in Spain, for us in London, for those in Germany and Sweden, etc. And so then to find the energy without support, without resources, without funding, to then also build something that is collective it's very, very difficult. It's challenging, but it is happening in pockets, and it has to happen. I think it's really important. One of the things that comes to mind is related to what we were speaking about earlier with the knowledge of the elders. So I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think that our ancestors are people who have died only, and only people who have lived in the continent. On this continent, we have a lot of Afro-European feminist grandmothers whom I think we really need to consult more. Because I sometimes play around with the idea in my head of what a matriarchy would look like. Not because I necessarily want that, because I think we need a system in which everybody is involved in. But basically, a patriarchy is the rule of old men, so the rule of grandfathers. And grandfathers can be lovely, but they're quite often, just to draw from the archetype, the grandfather archetype plays around with the children, imparts wisdom, and then goes to his study and is preoccupied. The grandmother archetype is what would inform a matriarchy. And that archetype is loving, compassionate, but also very frank, very wise, very, very willing to say, this is what you need to do. And I think we need to invite that into these questions more. So maybe just as a little bit of inspiration, let's ask the grandmothers, the black grandmothers in Europe, what do they think we should do? How do we connect?
Okay, so we ran out of time. We definitely needed much more time to talk about all these topics. So thank you. I don't know if you're going to make a presentation or something. Okay, so Minna is going to be signing her book, I think next to here. So Minna, thank you for coming here and to having this conversation. I think it was really interesting to hear your answers. And yeah, we are waiting for your next book and the next ideas. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.